For a long time, the Pauper meta was a very steady meta, but in the past month it underwent a lot of changes, from the bannings of its best deck in Glitters to a shakeup in the whole format after MH3, even before the meta could settle after the Glitters ban, now to a resurgence in mono-red aggro. Being a Pauper player in 2024 is a little bit of a roller coaster. But don't fret, I'm here to save the day. With new effort from the Pauper community, spearheaded by Kerblinksy, we can now analyze the current Pauper challenges and determine what works and what does not. So strap in, enjoy a summary of the current state of Pauper. Let's talk about the clockwork percussionist in the room. Mono-red has arisen again. Since Duskmourne's release, the usage rate of mono-red is above 18%. Everybody knows red is the enemy number one, and so everybody picks a deck equipped in dealing with it. The win rate therefore dropped to under 48%. Comparing this to the data prior to Duskmourne, where the win rate was about 49%, this seems a bit weird. How can mono-red get an upgrade, but its win rate goes down? The answer is simple. By being so oppressive that all decks that have a bad matchup against mono-red get bullied out of the meta, only bad matchups for mono-red remain. Mono-red basically is too good for its own sake. Coincidentally, two of the best decks in the format do have a good matchup against it, and that would be Grixis Affinity and Mono Blue Terror. Speaking of Mono Blue Terror, this was the definitive best deck in the post-MH3 meta. Since basically only mono-red got an upgrade, that matchup being favorable for Terror, it continues to perform very well. It did lose its place at the top though, since Grixis Affinity and Gruul Stompy are bad matchups. These decks get picked up more and more because they can compete with mono-red and therefore the win rate suffers. Overall, it's still a good deck and it continues to perform very well. An adaptation seems to be playing the old Dimir Terror lists again. Having access to board wipes, life gain and removal results in a very different matchup spread. Dimir has better bad matchups, with being slightly favored against Grixis and not instantly falling to Gruul Stompy, but trades those matchups for a slightly unfavored mono-red matchup. It also does not that well against the mono-colored counterpart, scoring about 49% win rate against Mono Blue Terror. Before we go into the biggest winners, and probably the best decks going forward, let's round out the section with the rest of the most commonly played decks: Grixis Affinity, Giant Brute Scale, and Gruul Stompy. Currently Grixis Affinity lists are on the rise. Its meta share is above 10%. With a good mono-red and mono-blue matchup, it's easy to see why this deck has success. It does struggle against the Giant Brute Scale and Gruul Stompy lists. Those decks seem to keep it in check. Looking at the Brute Scale deck, we see the exact opposite situation. While a good choice into Grixis Affinity and Gruul Stompy, it performs very poorly against Terror variants and mono-red. Rounding out the section with Gruul Ramp, nowadays the preferred way of casting Cascade creatures, the deck does hold its own against mono-red and has good matchups into the other most played decks. Only the Giant Brute Scale deck seems to keep up with a 47% win rate for Gruul. Despite that, its overall win rate is down quite a bit, so if you don't hit those favorable matchups, it does not seem to perform quite that well. On a side note, even though Rakdos Madness got an upgrade with Duskmourne, the deck continues to perform very poorly. If you want to have success with it, it looks like you have to innovate the deck. Similarly, Azorius Familiars seems like a good matchup against mono-red, but in reality mono-red does beat it quite well. This makes it an underwhelming meta choice and probably is not worth picking up. But now to the real bangers. There are 3 decks that are really good meta picks if mono-red continues to thrive. The first deck is Boggles. Main deck life gain, threats untargetable by Lightning Bolt, and a quick clock, the hexproof creatures trample down the 3 goblins made by Kudoltha Rebirth. It is probably the worst matchup for mono-red, as red doesn't provide the tools to interact with the deck. Sadly, Boggles does not perform that well against Kragland Shaman decks, and therefore isn't the overall best meta pick currently. If you are expecting a lot of mono-red, it is the number 1 pick against that specific deck. The second deck is Turbo Fog. Its worst matchups are Mono Blue and Brute Scale, but all other decks cannot outrun the Fog. Do keep in mind, this data is from Magic Online, so picking up the deck in paper is much more difficult as it produces a lot of draws. And finally, I want to mention Dimir Fairies. This deck currently is on a run and sports a very high win rate. Like most of these outlier win rates, this is due to a small sample size. If we factor in data since Modern Horizons 3, we will see that it is still good with a good mono-red matchup. Therefore, all signs point towards it being a great deck to pick up. Do you yourself want to analyze the current Pauper meta, look up matchups, or are interested in a meta-analysis with actually correct data? I've made just the place to do that. If you follow this link, which is also in the description, you can find the tool I made to analyze this dataset. You have the ability to select if you want to see results based on matches played or games played, select the time frame by selecting a date range or simply select sets, and see an overall meta-analysis or more detailed matchup matrix. I will try to continue updating with the latest data. Speaking of data, this analysis has been made possible by the great effort of Kerblingsy. He is probably the best resource for other Pauper-related videos at this point in time. This was actually my first ever real YouTube video. I encourage you to give me feedback, be it with a comment, a like or a dislike, and I am looking forward to playing and covering Pauper going into the new set Foundations.